One constant in India and with India has been this: caste. Every once in a while, India finds caste at the center of its politics.
But now, Dalits are saying, enough is enough.
And the reasons keep on varying. So in September 2022, when the Union government proposed to set up a national commission for examining the possibility of granting Schedule Caste, that is SC status to Dalits, who have converted to religions other than Hinduism, Buddhism and Sikhism, a whirlpool of debates, discussions and developments followed. Oh, here is the most interesting bit. Just a couple of weeks later, this same union government, which notified the appointment of this commission, also filed a 70-page affidavit with the Supreme Court opposing the inclusion of Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims in the SC list. So many raised the most obvious question: what is this paradox? Is this commission a sincere effort or just an eyewash? And what is this entire case of Schedule Caste's reservations? Let's break it down. Caste and Indian society go hand in hand, and their history is pretty old.
The people of India have a 3,000-year dialogue with caste, and they have given birth to the untouchables, the almost touchables, the semi-touchables and the higher caste.
To set the context straight, Dalits, which in Sanskrit means broken, are one of the most disadvantaged groups in India who have been facing oppression to the extent of untouchability for centuries. Relegated to the utmost bottom of this caste hierarchy, they fall outside the four main umbrella categories of the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras. In a caste system, a person's occupation and status in society are determined by their very birth, where hierarchy is strict and social mobility is next to impossible. This idea of caste goes back to the Hindu scriptures, and religious conversions to the theologically egalitarian religions have been a widespread response to this caste-based exploitation.
Last December in the city of Nagpur, more than 5,000 Dalits converted. Activists expect the numbers will increase as more Dalits reject their place at the bottom of Hindu society.
और उनके अंदर जो फ़र्क है उनके अमाल की वजह से होता है। पैदाइशी तौर पर उनके दरमियान कोई फ़र्क नहीं हो सकता। ये फ़लसफ़ा इस्लाम ने दिया और
lower caste Muslims and Christians have both converted to escape caste. Many of them have converted to escape caste, and that is something we should remember, and that is the enigma of caste in these religions.
But did conversions help?
But the way we have to think about this is I think twofold. One is conversion did not change the status in the larger hierarchy in society, because it is a society graded in every way. When the lower castes convert, their caste names remain the same. Their placing of where they are in the hierarchy remains the same.
हमारे हिंदुस्तान के अंदर भी जिन इलाकों के अंदर ये जात पात का निज़ाम था, वो उसी तरीके से राइज रहा जो पहले से चला आ रहा था।
तो वो सिर्फ वो नाम और ये धर्म बदलता है, जातीय स्थिति और सामाजिक स्थितियों कोई परिवर्तन नहीं।
Dalits who embrace Christianity and Islam continue to suffer extreme social, educational and even economic hardship.
The history of caste-based oppression also has a history of resistance.
Princely states in India, much before independence, had started introducing reservations or quotas for depressed classes. Many of these quotas also included quotas for Muslims, for instance, or Christians, for instance.
These reservation policies can be traced to this Raja of the princely state of Kolhapur, Rajashri Shahu, who authorized the reservation of the backward classes, the non-Brahmins, through an administrative order. It is believed that Shahu was inspired by Jyotirao Phule, an anti-caste social reformer who had proposed this idea of reservation in this deposition made before the Education Commission in 1881. Over the years, these reservation policies developed further, eventually incorporating political reservations as reflected in the Constitution of India today. But how did this transition take place?
Particularly starting from early 20th century, there has been a fair bit of political mobilization for recognition of caste. And I think one very important field of this recognition was, for instance, Ambedkar's politics around recognition of depressed classes, or what we now call the Schedule Castes, as a category for government amelioration or government taking policy decisions or interventions, welfare steps in order to make their conditions better.
It was under Ambedkar's leadership that the Pune Pact was signed, which established joint electorates with reserved seats for the depressed classes, a celebrated precursor to the existing political reservations in India. Around that time, a national movement was gaining ground against British colonial rule.
Champion of the Hindu minorities, Dr. Ambedkar, Labour member of the Government of India, is received by the committee of the All India Schedule Castes Federation on the occasion of their third annual conference in Bombay.
And the anxieties of minorities in this to be independent Indian state often took the dais.
आज अपनी किस्मत के आप खुद मालिक हैं और अगर आप मालिक हैं और मैदान में खड़े हुए हैं तो ये याद रखिए कि तरह-तरह की आजमाइशें पेश आएंगी.
And when the constitutional framers used to talk about the minority question or inclusion of minorities, they were really talking about not just religious minorities like Muslims or Sikhs, but they were also talking about caste minorities like Dalits or scheduled caste and untouchables.
So, in time, the minority question included religious minorities, Dalits, and also tribal groups who had been marginalized because of their geographical isolation. Eventually, the Constituent Assembly of India adopted the recommendations of the Advisory Committee during the August 1947 session, and seats were reserved for minorities while separate electorates were abolished. Even this draft Constitution of India had special provisions for minorities. But unfortunately, this is not how it ends.
Now, obviously, the big thing that happened around the time when the Constitution started getting framed was the partition of the country.
For the masses, it's the weary trail of the road.
With the settling dust of partition, this assumingly settled issue of minority rights was reopened. On 11th May 1949, the committee passed the said resolution with one dissenting voice. The system of reservation for minorities other than scheduled castes in legislatures be abolished.
So then the only minority eventually that gets that political representation are the untouchable or the Adivasi communities and not religious minorities.
Later, to implement these reservation policies and to identify the relevant castes and tribes, two constitution orders were issued by the President. One, the Constitution Scheduled Castes Order 1950 under Article 341, and two, the Constitution Scheduled Tribes Order 1950 under Article 342. While the Scheduled Tribes Order was a religious neutral category, the Scheduled Castes Order was the opposite.
जो संविधान मूल रूप में उसमें कोई बंदिश नहीं है रिलीजन का, बाद में 1950 में 341 धारा पर एक मजहबी पाबंदी रिलीजियस कैप आयद कर दिया.
With the 1950 order, scheduled castes was restricted as a Hindu-specific category with the exception of 4 Sikh groups. The inclusion of these 4 Sikh groups were substantiated after the unanimous demand of Sikh representatives of the East Punjab Legislative Assembly. It wasn't just the Sikhs who were struggling against caste.
When aksariyat and akliyat is being talked about, right? So majority and minority, and the talk of minority provinces has already started. Talk of Pakistan has started. So the Muslim, the people of the Momin Conference, many of them obviously Ansaris, are talking about how Pakistan makes no sense for them because if they are in Pakistan, they will still be, tilling the fields of their Pathan zamindars. So they said we will be petrified in the Akliyat provinces, in the minority provinces.
Founded in Bengal, the All India Momin Conference was a socio-political movement to organize the weavers community. Its vice president, Abdul Qayyum Ansari, on various occasions had written to Rajendra Prasad, Mahatma Gandhi, and also
to Jawaharlal Nehru, saying that, as you should know that like there is caste in Hindus, there is caste in Muslims, and we do not recognize Jinnah or the Muslim League as our leaders.
Ali Anwar's Masawat Ki Jang unveils a reply to one of these letters in which the former Prime Minister of India acknowledges the caste question among the Muslim community but disagrees with the solution of reservations, citing it as communal and vulnerable to Hindu groups making a similar demand. Also, just a few days before the adoption of the Indian Constitution, T.J.M. Wilson spoke for the Harijan Christians in the Constituent Assembly, highlighting the caste practiced by the community itself.
But his plea was unheeded. In general, the case for Dalits of the Christian and the Muslim communities could not be made in the Constituent Assembly. So the question arises, why did their representatives fail to deliver?
My best guess is, let me say two. One is that Muslim leadership, by and large, was dominated by Ashraf communities. The second was history, right? So when the demand for Muslim reservations was always framed as a demand for Muslims as a whole, then to sort of introduce a very new language to thinking about the relationship between the community and the state is not easy, right? And I don't think it was possible for many of those members to respond in those really difficult times of partition, of Muslim and Christian sort of feeling of potential sort of fear in a new country.
The question of scheduled castes reservation was revived later. In 1953, Master Tara Singh and Shiromani Akali Dal demanded the inclusion of all the untouchable castes who converted to Sikhism.
The government conceded the demands, and in 1956 the order was amended to include Dalit Sikhs. The next amendment came in 1990 to include Dalit Buddhists.
In 1950, at least there was a principle. Now we may agree or disagree with it, but the principle was, if your religious doctrine has caste, you will be accepted as a scheduled caste person. Once Sikhs and Buddhists are included, then that principle of religious doctrine doesn't hold anymore. And if you look at the parliamentary debates, by 1980s, 90s, when people started raising this, the politicians and parliamentarians who wanted to exclude Muslims and Christians, they started to argue that no, actually the principle is not purely what the religious doctrine says. The principle is what is an Indic religion and what is a non-Indic religion. So when it comes to Indic religions like Sikhs, Buddhists, Hindus, etc., caste is part of their social fabric. Whereas non-Indic religions like Islam and Christianity do not have caste as part of their social fabric. And therefore,
वो सिर्फ आरएसएस की थ्योरी है कि कुछ मज़ाहिब जो हैं वो बाहर से आए हैं और कुछ मज़ाहिब जो हैं वो इस मुल्क के अंदर के हैं. ये तकसीम बिल्कुल गलत है. क्यों? क्योंकि मज़हब जो है वो रीजन स्पेसिफिक नहीं है.
The big question when the Supreme Court hears this matter would precisely be this: can religious discrimination based on this distinction between Indic and non-Indic be sustainable at all? In my view, absolutely not. It just cannot be.
Even for the sake of argument, if we were to be sold by the idea of caste-based reservations reasoned on Indic versus non-Indic, a bigger question looms in the background. What about the sociological reality of caste?
Now, suppose I am a Bhangi who is called a Bhangi by the community. It's considered to be bad language, right? But I'm using it in an academic fashion. So I am a member of the Bhangi community, and I am treated as a so-called untouchable by members of other castes, particularly upper castes in my neighborhood. Does it matter if tomorrow I change my name from Rakesh to Ali? Will the rest of the people who treat me as a pariah treat me differently because now my name has become Ali as opposed to Rajesh or Rakesh? My answer to that would be obviously not.
Of course, the argument is that they just see us as Muslims, they don't see us as Dalits or Sayyids. But the way where you live, your house, Your house is called Ambedkar Nagar. Varanasi, the Muslim Dalit area is called Ambedkar Nagar. It's very obvious. Caste is codified in everything we do. These are people whose houses are behind, sewage tanks and behind the kachra ka dhera.
समाज के अंदर इस तरह के लोगों को बुरा भला कहा जाता है, बल्कि आसपास के इलाकों में चोरी या किसी तरह कोई अप्रिय घटना घटित होती है तो लोग उस तरफ उंगली उठाते हैं कि इसी मोहल्ले के लोग रहे होंगे जिसने इस तरह की घटना को अंजाम दिया है.
So in a country where most people are Hindus and the upper castes and their religious beliefs make them believe, arguably, in caste hierarchy, it doesn't matter what my religious beliefs are. What matters is what their religious beliefs are. So if I change my religious belief, that will not change the way they look at me.
This concern, the contention with the constitutional validity of this order, and the grievances of the communities suffering all have been put forward time and again.
August 10th, the day on which this order was signed, is observed as Black Day by Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims.
It has been argued that this order is inconsistent with Articles 14, 15, 16 and 25 of the Indian Constitution, which primarily deal with the equality and freedom of religion. A 2007 report of the National Commission of the Religious and Linguistic Minorities has straight up called it unconstitutional.
Various petitions as early as 2004 have been filed in the courts. Most recently, Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Hind, the oldest Muslim organization in India, also moved an application in this regard.
शेड्यूल कास्ट का कोई भी आदमी अगर अपना मज़हब बदल ले तो उसका जो रिजर्वेशन का जो उससे बेनिफिट मिला था वो उसको सिर्फ वापस ले लिया जाएगा. अब ये बताइए इससे बड़ा डिस्क्रिमिनेशन और क्या हो सकता है?
मजहब के बुनियाद पर हमारे साथ, हमारे दलितों के साथ, हमारे पसमानदा तरीन मुसलमानों के साथ, हमारे ईसाई दलितों के साथ जो तफरीक हो रहा है, जो भेदभाव हो रहा है, उसको हम खत्म करने की मांग कर रहे हैं.
The core argument for us and for anybody else is that the Constitution does not accept a division of its people on the basis of religion.
Many argue that this order is structured to favor reconversion to the Hindu fold.
It has been criticized for serving as a serious impediment to Article 25, freedom of religion.
However, paragraph 3 of this very order states that no person who professes a religion different from the Hindu faith, the Sikh or the Buddhist religion shall be deemed to be a member of the scheduled caste.
The Honorable Courts actually sanction some form of ghar wapsi when it suggests that you lose your caste status and SC, scheduled caste benefits, etc. when you convert out of, say, Hinduism, but you revive it. Your caste status gets revived even if after 2 or 3 generations you come back to Hinduism. So there is a sort of a incentive being provided.
John Dayal has sternly criticized this order, calling it an anti-conversion law.
This law says if you leave Hinduism, you will be punished by having all your statutory rights, political rights, by reserved seats in parliament, legislative assemblies, and in panchayats, your economic rights by way of scholarship and education and employment. So when these rights are being taken away by this absolutely ferocious law, what do we call it?
So, how has the Indian judiciary responded to the constitutionality of Para 3 of this order? A government report cites that the only available judgment of this issue is the case of Susai versus Union of India.
So ultimately what Supreme Court says in the judgment is rather convoluted. It basically says, yes, of course, caste does exist among Christians and hence by extension Muslims, but well, the petitioner needs to establish that the kind of disadvantage that exists for this person is the same as would be for a person who hasn't converted to Christianity or Islam. Now that is a standard that doesn't exist in any other sort of context when caste is approached.
In the end, the burden of proof fell on the petitioner, a Dalit Christian himself. The court ruled on the grounds of technicality rather than merit, and the petition was dismissed.
One of the main reasons why Supreme Court in Susai was wrong was also from a very pragmatic point of view. An individual can't produce socio-economic data. It is the responsibility of the state to produce socio-economic data. Second, it is the responsibility of the state to justify its policies. The burden of justification must fall on the state. It can't fall on the citizen.
Will this judgment hold ground now?
In fact, can the argument of a lack of data concerning the conditions of Dalit converts to Christianity or Islam be justified anymore to keep excluding them?
We don't have too much data, but we also don't have that little data. At least we have as much data as we had for Sikhs or Buddhists to be declared, scheduled caste status. And there's been a lot of ethnographic work on Muslim communities, on Christian communities.
Post-suicide, and it's now 40 years after that, more than 40 years, there has been much data collected.
Various government reports have acknowledged how caste has pervaded Christian and Muslim communities. Look here at the reports of the first and second backward class commissions. This 1983 report on minorities, the Sacha Committee report, Ranganatha Mishra Commission report, and this 2008 report prepared for the National Commission for Minorities.
We talked to Professor Satish Deshpande, a sociology professor at Delhi University, who is the lead author of this 2008 report.
We were asked to look at existing social science literature to determine whether the decision to exclude Dalit Muslims and Dalit Christians from the ambit of reservation continued to be justified. So we looked at the literature and we found that on the basis of both qualitative and the new quantitative analysis we did on the basis of the new NSSO survey that had just become available, that there was no reason whatsoever to exclude Dalit Muslims and Christians from reservation, going by the criteria that had been used to justify it for the other groups.
His report found that Dalit Muslims were unquestionably among the worst of Dalits, and that there is a strong case for according scheduled caste status to Dalit Muslims and Christians.
And again, it is not just one report that makes this recommendation. It is one of many.
Look at this list right here. This 2007 report, chaired by the former Chief Justice of India, recommended deleting Para 3 of the 1950 order to make the scheduled castes net fully religion neutral.
Despite all these recommendations and evidence on the sociological reality of caste, the opposition to the inclusion of Dalit Christians and Muslims has not ended. Some find these studies to be flawed in one way or another. Thus, the catchphrase of lack of relevant data keeps on echoing. So what is the way out to make a case for inclusion?
The possible answer is a new caste census. Unlike a population census, a caste census includes a caste-wise tabulation of India's population, the last of which was done in 1931.
जाति जनगणना होनी चाहिए. कई सुप्रीम कोर्ट भी इस बात को कह रहे हैं कि भाई रिजर्वेशन में तो इधर उधर कर रहे हैं, इधर से उधर कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उसका कोई ऑथेंटिक डाटा नहीं है, न हिंदू का है न मुसलमान का है.
After partition, though the census for scheduled castes was continued, the exclusion of Christians and Muslims from this category invisibilized their numbers.
But you look at colonial census, there are 70,000 Bhangis, Muslim Bhangis in 1911 in India census. Where are they now? Where are these 70,000 people, from the Bhangi caste today? So they exist. Right? They exist, and just because they are not, there at whatever Jashn-e-Ekta or something, doesn't mean that this is not, this is not a Muslim problem.
New numbers call for a new share in the SC quota, which is limited to just 15%. This is often rephrased into another ground for opposition. So, we asked the obvious question.
Will including Dalit Christian and Muslim in the SC category distinct beneficiaries of these reservations as the quota is limited?
When Sikhs were added, when Buddhists were added, did anybody use this argument?
Over the years, various new castes have been added to the SC category without scaling up the cap of 15% reservations. And in 2019, 10% of the reservations were approved for the economically weaker sections in the unreserved category by BJP government, essentially creating opportunities for the upper castes.
OBC में है वो ऑलरेडी. हम ये कह रहे हैं कि उससे निकाल करके उसके दूसरे कंपार्टमेंट में ले जाइए जिसमें शेड्यूल कास्ट के लोग हैं, और ले जाइए और शेड्यूल कास्ट का कोटा बढ़ा के ले जाइए। वरना अगर ऐसा कोटा नहीं बढ़ाएंगे तो बीजेपी को ये मौका मिल जाएगा कि देखो मुसलमान आ रहे हैं, तुम्हारा हक हिस्सा हड़पने के लिए आ रहे हैं। तो ये मौका नहीं मिले। हम जा रहे हैं तो अपने खाने पीने रहने का सामान लेकर के जा रहे हैं वहाँ, तो ये करना है इनको।
Yes, certain communities of Christians and Muslims are recognized as OBCs, other backward classes, and they avail reservations meant for them. Unlike its name, OBC is not purely an economic category. It has historically been constructed in relation to caste. The indicators of both backward classes commissions say it all. So, here, first out of the blue, the state chooses to recognize caste among Christians and Muslims, and second, this inclusion in the OBC is seen as a good enough reservation policy for Dalits of these communities. But is it?
SC/ST reservations are unlike OBC reservations in that they were designed to address a very severe and long-standing form of social exclusion. And since Dalit Muslims and Dalit Christians, both within their own communities as well as in society at large, suffer from precisely the same forms of discrimination and exclusion, it is a matter of ethical correctness for them also to be included in this.
Let's jump to data now.
Though the findings of the Mandal report grouped 52% of the Indian population as OBCs, and that too based on the 1931 census, it ended up recommending only 27% of reservations.
It comes as no surprise that there is hard-fought competition among the OBC groups already, regardless of the degree of backwardness.
तो जो 4-5 जातियां हैं परी, उन्हीं को जो रिजर्वेशन का फ़ायदा है वो मिल जाता है, और बाकी जो है नालबंद हैं, नाचेबंद हैं, बख्खो हैं, हलालखोर हैं, गधेरी हैं, भटियारा हैं, ये सब तो पीछे के पीछे ही रह जाते हैं।
This Sachar committee report has noted that the inclusion of Dalit Muslims in the OBC list has failed to make any impact as they're clubbed with the more advanced middle castes.
चूँकि अभी हम लोगों को दलितों वाला रिजर्वेशन नहीं मिला है, तो पसमानदा से हम लोग काम चला रहे हैं।
ने कहा कि एक मास्टर हो जाता है कोई इस बिरादरी का, इन बिरादरियों का, तो पूरे इलाके में नाम हो जाता है। फलनवा धोबी का लड़का मास्टर हो गए कहो, फलनवा अब हलखोर का हलालखोर का लड़का बबुआ चपरासी हो गई को, ऐसा नाम होता है। तो वो कुछ नहीं है भाई, ये कैसे समाज चलेगा? उनको हिस्सेदारी होनी चाहिए।
This is the most crucial demand, political representation.
Unlike OBCs, SCs have electoral quotas, reserved seats in the electoral constituencies, which secures their representation in the political institutions of the state.
कि उसके जो OBC के अंदर है वो रिजर्वेशन जो है वो जिस हिसाब से मिलता है, वो तालीम के अंदर मिलता है, वो मुलाजमतों के अंदर मिलता है, वो पॉलिटिकल रिजर्वेशन नहीं है। शेड्यूल कास्ट में पॉलिटिकल रिजर्वेशन है कि वो कुछ सीटें जो हैं शेड्यूल कास्ट के लिए रिजर्व हैं।
अगर ये हो जाता है तो मुस्लिम समाज का जो दलित वर्ग है उनकी न सिर्फ शैक्षणिक स्थिति में सुधार होगा, जैसा कि हम लोग देखते रहते हैं, बल्कि सामाजिक स्थिति बदलेगी, आर्थिक स्थिति बदलेगी और राजनीतिक स्थिति में भी बदलाव आएगा। चूँकि हम लोग देखते रहते हैं कि बहुत सारी जगहों पे जो मतलब सीटें हैं उस पर भी मतलब फ़ायदा हो सकता है जो मुस्लिम समाज का दलित वर्ग होगा।
This research study established that quotas have been effective at guaranteeing the political presence of SCs. Also, in a research paper by Esther Duflo, it was observed that political reservations for disadvantaged groups enhanced their access to political decision-making and entailed representation of the weaker groups.
Dalit Christians and Muslims suffer the twofold hardship of being a Dalit and a religious minority.
जितना भी दंगा फसाद हो रहा है, मॉब लिंचिंग हो रही है, घर वापसी के नाम पर, लब जिहाद के नाम पर जो लोग मारे जाते हैं वो पसमानदा और दलित मुसलमान ही मारे जाते हैं।
Both scheduled castes and scheduled tribes groups are protected by the SC/ST Act, which prevents the commission of offences of atrocities against them, provides special courts for the trial of offences, and assists them in receiving relief and rehabilitation of victims.
In 2002, a national commission also recommended that this act should be amended to include Dalit Christians.
तो अगर दलित में हमारे वो लोग रहेंगे तो न सिर्फ उनको नौकरियों में रिजर्वेशन मिलेगा, न सिर्फ उनको पार्लियामेंट और असेंबली की सीटों पर दावेदारी करने का मौका मिलेगा, बल्कि उनके साथ जो अत्याचार होगा उस पर अत्याचार करने वाले पर शेड्यूल कास्ट, शेड्यूल ट्राइब एक्ट, SC ST एक्ट के अनुसार उन पर कार्रवाई होगी, उनकी हिफाजत मिलेगी, उनको सुरक्षा मिलेगी।
Now, with the 2024 general elections in the picture, the politics around caste has gained momentum. The ruling right-wing government BJP is at the forefront of it.
पसमंदा मुसलमान मोची होते हैं, भिस्ती होते हैं, जोगी होते हैं, लालबेंगी होते हैं, उन्हें आज भी बराबरी का हक नहीं मिलता।
But many point out that it is to gain over the substantial voter base.
अफसोस की बात यह है कि अभी प्राइम मिनिस्टर ने तो उधर ये ऐलान किया कि वो पसमादा के लिए कुछ करना चाहते हैं, और दूसरी तरफ वहाँ कर्नाटका में हम देखते हैं कि 4% रिजर्वेशन जो था वो भी गया। तो ये उनके करने और कहने में जो फ़र्क है, इस फ़र्क को देखने की ज़रूरत है। इससे साफ पता चलता है कि दे आर ओनली यूजिंग एज ए पॉलिटिकल टूल, और ये सिर्फ जुमलेबाजी है।
पसमानदा से हमदर्दी है तो पसमानदा में भी जो पसमानदा तरीन है, हमारे दलित मुसलमान है, दलित ईसाई है, उनको शेड्यूल कास्ट का दर्जा दीजिए, तब में समझा जाएगा कि हमदर्दी। तो यहाँ तो बीजेपी ने लिख करके सुप्रीम कोर्ट के जवाब में दे दिया कि ये काम हम नहीं करेंगे, तो नहीं करेंगे तो ये हमदर्दी का कोई मतलब नहीं है।
While Pasmanda, the backward castes of the Muslim community, are of significant numbers, Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims are minority amongst the minorities. It seems their numbers are not enough to be an asset for the political parties in a representative democracy.
सब लोगों ने, कई पार्टियों ने, कांग्रेस ने, जेडीयू ने, आरजेडी ने अपने अपने चुनाव घोषणा पत्र में इस मांग को रखा, लेकिन बस वही कागज में लिख दिया, कुछ जमीन पर किया नहीं, प्रस्ताव पास कर दिया, जमीन पर किया नहीं।
And so it happens, till today, roughly an estimated 3.2 million people, the Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims, who need to be at the center of policy debates and affirmative action initiatives, remain excluded, pushed to the periphery and prohibited from accessing their rightful dues. Is their exclusion fair?